Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to our next episode of Leaders for Humanity. And I have to say, today I'm especially proud and pleased to be able to present you a gentleman that has not only intrigued us, but also disturbed us with some of his writings in regards to bridging morality and management, and who has really triggered our thinking, and who is a true philosopher, and who I'm sure will explain a little bit more to us during the course of events, what the philosophy of organization is all about. But without further ado, a big warm welcome to Harry Tsoukas from the University of Cyprus. Harry, a warm welcome.
Hello. Hi,
so
both.
Wonderful to have you here, I have to say. And indeed, I don't want to steal the thunder of Antoinette, who will do proper introductions in a second. But in your wonderful book on the philosophy of organizations, Harry, you start off with Plato saying that the sense of wonder is the first necessary characteristics of a philosopher. And you continue to saying that the wonder, the ability to inquire in current concepts and theories, and also the willingness to go beyond and propose new theories is part of that philosophical meta-inquiry of what life, what organizations are all about. And I really hope we can bring some of this towards our audience today. So again, thank you very much. And this inquiry, as our current listeners know, is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do here. So we will again just very briefly recap on the Good Organizations Inquiry project. Secondly, Antoinette will, as usual, do much more proper introductions of Harry Tsoukas, and then we will go into the usual discussion along the lines of good organizations in the context of morality and in the context of how can we transform towards such good organizations. And here, let me just again spend 2 words on what the Good Organizations Inquiry is all about. Antoinette and I decided a few months ago to set time in our lives and professions apart for an inquiry about what is good in the context of modern business. In the 21st century, what can organizations in this complex and demanding environment do to really contribute as actors in society to their environment, as containers and synergetic engines for the communities that they serve and that they include, and finally as the kind of trustees for the development of the individual to become better. And we are trying to involve in this journey lots of people who have interesting thoughts, researchers who can take some of those thoughts and qualify them in regards to empirical evidence, and finally politicians and business leaders who might be willing to experiment with some of these bold new ideas to see if together in a pragmatic fashion we can move forward. And with that, straight over to you, Antoinette, for proper introductions of bridging morality and management of wonder, wisdom, and character.
Wonderful. Thank you, Otti. Well, I also would like to welcome Harry. And well, first of all, it's always nice to say he's at 2 places professor. He's a professor of organizational behavior at Warwick Business School, but also a professor of strategic management and dean at the University of Cyprus, where I tend to think you have the better weather, but that's just a side remark. I also need to say that, because I just love the name of it, that you are the recipient of the Joan Martin Trailblazer Award. I mean, that's really a fancy name and sounds really good to me. And you are the 18th honorary member of the European Group of Organization Studies. Otti, that means EGOS. But unlike the name, EGOS is really a great and inclusive conference, because that's really the reason why I am in research, because that was the first conference where you were even accepted as a young researcher. He's academic advisor to the Hellenic Association of Chief Executive Officers. I also love that a lot. Former chief editor of Organization Studies, a really remarkable because different type of journal in our field, and co-organizer of many nice symposia, often taking place in Greece. So, I mean, everybody wants to go there normally. Beyond this, and here Otti indeed stole my thunder a little bit, I read that you are or were a rather unhappy engineer, which is good for us, I have to say, because now you took a look at organizations with the attitude of wonder. So I think we both picked that up. It's really lovely to hear something like that, as organizations do not cease to amaze us. And I really, really like that. You do this, of course, with a variety of lenses, and I have to say that's seldom with one researcher that you see something like that. So it's Heidegger, Husserl, Aristotle, Tchatzky, Dewey, Wittgenstein, and many, many more. And as you can imagine, preparing for this interview was really hard work, but I hope it was also insightful for us. Finally, and that's something we really cherish, I would like to say that you also step into the role of an engaged citizen. In one Laudatio, I was reading that you once even were a candidate in the general election. And another thing I saw, because I couldn't access the article, that you have published in a journal where Varoufakis normally is publishing. So I find that also, of course, quite interesting in that space. Well, but as usual, if you are presented by somebody else, I'm sure we're missing out on the more interesting bits. And that's why I would like to give you the opportunity to first describe yourself with a few attributes.
Thank you, Otti. Thank you, Antoinette, for this very kind invitation. I'm honored to join you in this conversation. Well, I think probably a third person, an observer, has a better understanding of the person presented. But what I could probably say is that I'm not a professional philosopher. So I don't want to claim anything which might be seen as usurping the title of another discipline or claiming qualifications I do not have. But at the same time, to paraphrase slightly Wittgenstein, I'm not a philosopher, but I cannot help but see everything from a philosophical point of view. And that brings us to wonder. Again, it's not particularly original. It goes back to Plato. Heidegger takes it up again, that the aim of philosophical inquiry is wonder, that is to look at the world with amazement, but at the same time inquisitiveness. And the same, of course, applies to us as organizational scholars. Organizations will never cease to surprise us, to amaze us. And at the same time, we want to inquire more about the nature of organizing, what it means to organize ourselves in the way we do in late modern societies, facing the challenges organizations face these days. And as we're speaking, the leaders of hundreds of nations are in Glasgow convening for the climate change, to discuss climate change and what can we do about this. So that naturally, to me, it brings us back to one of my fundamental concerns, that is organizations as a force for the common good. And if you put it in those terms, you have already put morality, ethics into the inquiry. And that is important because traditionally, if you take a narrowly scientific or scientistic, to be more precise, point of view, then you don't care about questions like this. You will try to dissect any phenomenon of interest and then dissociating it from any value system. And just to go back in the 50s, when Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner, he wrote in his administrative behavior that we don't typically accept evaluative statements in administrative science. We need to split the values from facts, and scientists should concentrate only on ascertaining causal relationships or enabling predictions about states in the world, but leaving values to the philosophers or the theologians. Well, I don't think this is common wisdom now. I think we don't accept this. And in fact, I'm not the first one to suggest that this should not be the guiding light for the field. And on the contrary, we should try to merge value-based questions with what we would call more traditionally science-based questions.
Absolutely. And I think, Antoinette, lots of things come up. I think we heard from Blaine Fowler that we have to bite the epistemological bullet of really examining our value statements, which are persistent in most of the research and writings academia do. Stefano Zamani was calling for an axiological requalification of the economic science, because indeed value judgments are persistent but not queried. I also love your notion of Heidegger in terms of wonder. I think Heidegger suggested that in a postmodern society, we have focused too much on curiosity, which is the startling of the big and the unusual, whereas wonder is about finding the unusual in the mundane. And I think that is a very, very interesting notion. But I cannot get you in this first section completely go away with just science, Harry, if I may. Heidegger, I believe, and of course you made us read through Sein and Zeit, which was a really difficult lecture, can I just say, alongside. So Heidegger, I think, coming from a very Catholic tradition and a very orderly worldview, spent most of his time, especially after falling in love with a lovely woman in, I think, Heidelberg, spent most of his life trying to reconcile his philosophical beliefs with a system that doesn't require God. And he, I think, at some stage was after a philosophy of practical love. And I wonder how much of your inquiry that you have clearly been very invested in, Harry, is autobiographic. What is your desire through your work? What is that good life that you are trying to develop through what you're doing?
Well, in a very kind of, I have a very traditional view of this. The good life for me is the scholarly life, which, however, it is a scholarly life which has some impact in the world. Antoinette mentioned earlier that I try to be an engaged citizen. So as well as my academic pieces, I try to write for newspapers, to comment on current affairs, and so on. And all these forms of a continuum. So the good life of a scholar is a life which it is tied in scholarship and raising questions, exploring questions, and also taking any answers he or she comes up with into the practical domain and trying to make a difference in the world. And the way, I mean, people like us, the way we make a difference is not, we're not producing anything in a material sense, but our ideas, our concepts, the language that we use, and this is what we offer back to society, hopefully make some difference to the way we collectively see things. Just take the environment, for example. The environment 50 years ago was not an issue in organizational scholarship. It has gradually become an issue in scholarship, along with becoming an issue more broadly in socioeconomic life. And we need a different kind of vocabulary if we are to understand ourselves in terms of sustainability, for example. What kind of language do we need to do this? It's not good enough to say, well, we need to take the environment into account. Yes, but show me how. Show me the language I can use in order to do so. The kind of traditionally, the kind of Galilean or Cartesian view of science leaves out these questions, but it forms a coherent, it offers a coherent view of the world, a world which is lifeless, doesn't necessarily contain purpose. It is maybe mechanical necessity or even probabilistic necessity, but not necessarily something that is valuable and purposeful. And if we are to engage these concepts, how can we do so? So in Aristotle and Heidegger, I'm trying to find a way in which I can incorporate some of their thinking into our field in order to make a difference to the way we view organizations and economic life more generally, and therefore live better lives.
Well, what better life to live than, I mean, that I think was also Aristotle's view than the one of contemplation. So in that sense, but of course, you're also stepping into the political role in that sense. You have both in that, but that's of course always a big privilege that we have in academia, I think.
Interestingly, for Aristotle, the political life is not a very pleasant life. And in fact, for him, the kind of the relaxed way of living is the contemplative life, purely just to think about the world. But then, of course, when we think about practical matters, then practical wisdom comes into the picture, and we cannot escape making choices and making judgments as to how we are going to conduct ourselves individually, collectively, societally.
Judgments in action, and we will come to that in a second, not only on action. And I wanted to just say one thing. Antoinette actually I was privileged in joining a seminar that Antoinette held with the University of St. Gallen 2 weeks ago. And indeed, I saw how difficult it is sometimes to bring that examination of judgment back into science, because there's so much focus on publication, on getting into the next journal. And actually, even the young PhD students sometimes don't have the tools or the language, like you say, to qualify their own thinking from an epistemological perspective. And I think I'm very glad that some of you informed scholars are going into this direction. But Antoinette, have you got one more question in this section, or shall I bring up the usual slide?
I think you bring up the usual slide now.
Then let me bring up just again to position for our listeners the way we're going to go about this. And I want to do, with Antoinette's help, just do a little bit of contextualization, because again, Harry's work, which I invite everybody to have a look at, and again on the website you will find pointers, is vast. And Harry, I think we've tried a little bit to structure it because it is vast, so that we don't lose ourselves, but also some people listening don't lose themselves. So the first section, we want to focus on morality, philosophy, what good is, and what the good society is. In the second section, we want to go more into what does that mean for organizations in terms of building on McIntyre's VPI, so the Virtuous Practice Institution model. What does it also mean from an epistemological, ontological perspective in terms of different theories of the firm? And we want to compare notes in this section also with what some of the other very kind of renowned and kind of honorable professors and academics and others have told us already. And finally, we want to go a little bit into the individual and transformation part, talking about phronesis, talking about societal change. We've seen you've also written about reform in the political institutions, and maybe talk a little bit about academia. So we will roughly try to align our discussion to these three axes. I'm sure we will not entirely manage, but we also decided last minute to squeeze your work on Bateson and system and complexity thinking a little bit into the middle section, because that is something we have been discussing before as well. So this for everybody just is the container for the session, and I would say off we go. And as usual, Antoinette, can I invite you to open the section?
Yeah, I think we start with what we have already started discussing, namely we dive directly into moral philosophy, and here, of course, you present Aristotelian view. So just also for your listeners, let us just look a little bit at the basic concepts here. So what is eudaimonia? And I probably pronounce it wrongly now.
No, that's fine.
What do we need? What is the common good? That's another important aspect here. And what does virtue ethics tell us about morals? Because a lot of people are not used to think in virtue ethics terms.
Yes, thank you, Antoinette. I think a kind of a simple point of entry, it is to say that virtue ethics is concerned with what it is to be, how it is to act well in the world. And it is underlain by a particular anthropology, which is about what is the good life. The good life, and that's what eudaimonia means, is that the happy life, the life that enables people to flourish. So this is the kind of notion of goodness. Aristotle is very keen to explore this. He thinks that every object and any kind of species in the world has a particular function, and the function of the human beings, it is to live life well. That is, life to have to be meaningful, and in a way that will enable people to unfold their capacities and to flourish. So this is what eudaimonia is all about. The good organization, the good society, is the society that enables people to do so. And here is the work of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize economist, on whose work on capabilities has been not just importance from a scholarly point of view, but also of intense utility. It has been taken up by the United Nations by focusing on capabilities, on what capabilities people need to be provided with in order to flourish. So to flourish, you need to have, this is reminiscent of Maslow to some extent, but it goes well beyond this. The ability to be able to live a good, meaningful life implies that you can make use of resources which are appropriate to human beings, material, intellectual, and social resources, to enable them to lead the good life. So the good society is the society which is so set up and organized to enable people to do this. It has certain political implications, but we don't need to go into this. But except to note, perhaps philosophically, it is an anti-individualist way of looking at things. So from a purely individualistic point of view, ultimately, to caricature it a bit, like in the movie The Wall Street, it is all about what you do yourself, how can you advance yourself materially. It all depends on your hard work and nothing else. I'm caricaturing it a bit, but not a lot. The emphasis is on individual responsibility. Now, from a virtue ethics and point of view, then the kind of communal life in which we're engaged and from which individuals draw the resources, as well as the meaning of what they do, is of profound importance, and we cannot neglect it. And for the classical Greeks, any citizen who does not care about the common affairs of the city was called an idiot. So idiot in classical Greek means the person who does not care for the common affairs of the city. Of course, it has taken different meanings in the European languages, but it's worth revisiting the original meaning as well. You cannot live a good life all by yourself unless you live in a properly set up communal context. That may be the polis, the city, the country, the society, or the organization. From our point of view, it is the organization which is the focus of attention, although we can expand our lens to include also societal institutions into how organizations are set up.
Very, very good. Thank you very much for positioning. I want to throw, if I may, a few concepts at you to qualify and maybe to compare and sharpen the distinction further, if that is possible. So one, and what came to my mind when you just explained idiot, I think Antoinette in Olson's work, he speaks about utopia being a Greek word which combines A as good, the non and the being. So it's utopia is a society that is good, but almost impossible to achieve. So
unattainable, yeah.
Unattainable, very interesting. So I want to throw the following at you, if I may. One, we talked to Bruno Frey extensively, and Bruno is, of course, very famous for his work on happiness in economics. So maybe one aspect to sharpen the contrast between eudaimonia as the objective happiness vis-a-vis happiness research. You mentioned Maslow, but Seligman and positive psychology, so to speak. Simon Weston spoke about the happiness imperative in modern society. So maybe that could be one island. The second one I would love to hear you talk about maybe is the functional argument about telos in Aristotelian thinking. Blaine Fowler's, of course, wrote a book about it, The Natural Theory of Ethics, combining it with evolutionary theory, trying to figure out what is it that is distinctively human if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective. So is that something that you're thinking about at all? And then finally, again, thinking about what Bruno told us in terms of drivers for happiness, at least, it seems to be a concoction, and empirical research not being very clear, between personal factors and psychological factors, demographical factors, and then institutional factors. And his work was very focused on direct democracy, potentially increasing happiness. And you just made a point on the correlation with societal or political systems. So maybe another qualification on happiness versus eudaimonia. Is it useful to look at in evolutionary terms what flourishing implies? And finally, could you maybe just qualify a little bit where you see political systems or institutional systems relate at the macro level with the concept of flourishing?
Yeah, thanks. These are very good questions, and I hope I can do justice to all of them. Let me begin briefly. Happiness versus eudaimonia. When economists typically talk about happiness, they tend to view it in more psychological terms, which is not the Aristotelian way. That's fine. Anything which can help us to break through the Homo economicus type of mold, that is good. That is, the Homo economicus that has desires, is driven by certain identities, certain values, to perhaps enhance his or her satisfaction, hedonic satisfaction. So happiness comes into the equation for the economists. For Aristotelians, this would be framed slightly differently, in the sense that happiness is flourishing. As I said, eudaimonia is all about flourishing, and underlining the kind of the valued aims, the valued ends that human activities aim at. So anytime when, as a teacher, as a nurse, as a doctor, as an accountant, any kind of practitioner I'm a member of a practice which is driven towards accomplishing the internal goods of the practice, that is, certain kind of goods which are inherently valuable into the practice. As teachers, we know this pretty well. There's the internal good, which is inherent into the practice of teaching, which is that I want to improve myself as a teacher. I want to find ever better ways of engaging my students in my class. And the internal goods are non-competitive goods. I can learn from you. You can learn from me. We can sort of commonly deliberate and explore ways of advancing what is defining in our in our practice. At the same time, we're not just teachers as practitioners, we're also members of universities, and universities are also institutions. So, and institutions, from a McIntyrean point of view, aim at external goods, that is, rewarding people, sanctioning people, distributing benefits, and therefore they introduce the competitive element. People can be paid differently. The outcomes of the organization will be judged into the market. So some services or products may not be valuable as much as the organization thinks they are. So the both of these things, the internal goods or the practice's internal goods and the external goods of the institution, ideally need to be aligned. That is always an accomplishment. That is always, it is ongoing work, because they can never be completely aligned. There are always tensions. We see this in business schools all the time. Business schools are the closest you can get to a business within a university, even within a state university, because they need to cater for the MBA market, for executive education. These are competitive products which any business school will need to offer. At the same time, there are practices, because they engage researchers and teachers, and they need to, and they have, these practices have their own internal goods. So the good in doing research for its own ends, the good in teaching, which is good in its own terms. So, but these do not necessarily align with the reputational benefits of the organization, of the institution, of the organization as an institution. So there is always need to be a concern for aligning these two, hence the need for making judgments. Those who lead organizations at all levels, they need to make constantly align judgments, that is, to try to align the internal goods and the external goods. Now, the evolutionary theory is, I'm familiar broadly. I can see a lot of, mileage in this. I have not engaged myself. The idea is very simple, that is, cooperation provides a competitive advantage to groups of people. So when people get together and they kind of naturally align themselves, and they have a biological, instinctively, biologically driven to cooperate, they have this instinct for cooperative behavior, then ultimately they're going to be rewarded. That is, I think there's a lot of things to explore. I'm not up to date with the latest developments on this, but I'm always happy to read contributions about this. But I must say, I can live without evolutionary theory. I don't necessarily need it for what I do. But if it is kind of underlain and supported by evolutionary theory, so much the better. Which, by the way, let me digress for a moment. One of my favorite books in philosophy was by Stephen Toulmin, Cosmopolis. Toulmin makes the argument that, the way we see the natural world and the way we see the social world are aligned. So we have a certain kind of image, underlying image, which informs all of our inquiries about the natural world and about the human world. So if you view the natural world as a machine, for example, chances are that you will also be viewing the human world in mechanistic terms similarly, and vice versa. If we enable ourselves to view nature and the natural world in non-mechanistic terms, it's likely that we will view the human world also in non-mechanistic terms, and the two are in a kind of osmosis all the time. So if evolutionary theory supports that kind of vocabulary,
I think it does, and we won't digress there. But I think it strengthens your argument in Blaine's thoughts, because it provides evidence for attachment behaviors, for the predisposition for social order, for example, and also it shows very interestingly that humans have developed an alternative strategy to domination, territorial domination, which is based on prestige. And that very much correlates with the thinking about professional practices. So I think there is some leeway in strengthening some of the functional argument and underlining it with those thoughts from evolutionary theory to say this is actually what is distinctly human vis-a-vis some of the other species that humans stem from. But I will leave it there.
Just to very quickly add
Go on,
something,
Antoinette.
because I think it also looks at this collective construals you were talking about, because he's also crafting out the relational view. So in that sense, probably don't need it for your argumentation, but it strengthens interesting to have.
I entirely agree. And I think this is what I didn't explain properly, but I was trying to get at by referring to Toulmin. You see, if relationality is a key image through which we conduct scientific research in a number of fields. And I think this kind of image is relatively new, that is in the last 50 years or so. Toulmin dates it primarily since the 60s, from the 60s onwards, when we started to query the purpose of science and how we conduct scientific inquiry. And I think this kind of relationality as an underlying image, indeed, it does reflect on evolutionary theory, as well as other developments that we see, like virtue ethics and so on. So yes,
I think, and the concept of identity, Harry, I think both at individual level, which is a relational construct per se, and social identity, and also social proof. I think, again, some of the mechanisms that seems to stem from evolution, I think, become very important when we then think about, okay, how do we change from where we are to where we want to go? But I think because I know Antoinette has the next question ready, but can I just quickly maybe on the societal aspect?
Yes.
So the last thing, is there anything that comes to your mind on that?
Well, the political systems are very important here in terms of capabilities. Education is a classic public good, or public health. One of the things the pandemic has shown is the importance of public goods. That is public health, education, and so on. So to be able to have systems and institutions that provide these public goods, I think this is vital for organizations as well. They make life better for organizations and for people in organizations. And another associated concept would be the kind of regulation that is necessary. And regulation, of course, happens at the state level, where the governments typically regulate certain domains. And by doing so, they sort of create a terrain within which organizations can function. We can see this with social media. In a kind of unregulated environment, then different kinds of behavior may be shown, and not all of which contribute to a flourishing life. So if we are bound by the concept of what is the good life, for example, to protect privacy, then we will regulate our society and our public goods in such a way that we will create a terrain within which then organizations may be set up and maybe and they can orient themselves to provide the goods that we value. So the politics is quite important, absolutely important. And one of the good things in institutional theory is that it brings it closer to organizations.
Indeed, and with Bruno Frey, we talked about public choice theory and some of those mechanisms from an economical perspective in the political world. But I think the reverse is equally important. Antoinette.
Yeah, I'm just, I mean, we could go on with that because that's a very interesting topic, but I just want to do one of our more conventional questions because I find it rather important in that section. I mean, you have elaborated nicely about moral philosophy. I think it's also intuitive and well understood. But on the other hand, we seem to have either an implementation problem or maybe it's also we are looking still at the world with the wrong language and the wrong theories, because we have, of course, CSR, and we have CSR for 50 years now. And most people would say CSR has failed. So what's wrong? Is it not about social responsibility? Should we rather have more this common good idea in mind? What is your take on this corporate social?
Yeah, I think the very idea of corporate social responsibility in itself has changed over time. So you can see a kind of minimalist understanding of CSR, which is some kind of corporate philanthropy. You give back to society you return to society some of the profits you have earned as a corporation. We're not very happy with this. Many people are not very happy with a minimalist definition, understanding of CSR. If we try to embed CSR into the logic of a corporation, and I refer you here to the Business Roundtable, for example, in the States, in which is very much more explicitly stakeholder-oriented, then we need to find ways of embedding it into our legal systems, but more importantly, into our own conceptual understanding of the corporation. That is the need to serve multiple stakeholders, the need to enhance and contribute to the common good of society. Now, that is, for me, it brings it closer to the moral understanding of business. Now, of course, you do realize this is very different from a kind of Friedmanian approach that the business of business is just business. It is much more than that. You see business being in the service of eudaimonia, in the service of contributing to the common good beyond the efficient allocation of economic resources, beyond the mere production of goods. Even from an Aristotelian point of view, the very production of goods is never mere production. It always incorporates understandings about how people relate to one another, and about what is the good we are producing for, what does it enable us to do, and to define it and redefine it in the course of time.
I think so. I want to defend Friedman a little bit here, because I think he's become from the person on the pedestal, so to speak, Chicago school, to the devil. And I think it is not black and white, because I think his argument, to a degree, similar to Hayek's argument, was the problem is that the moment that you intervene to correct the shareholder focus of the firm, you're creating unintended consequences that end up being worse than the potential unintended benefits. So there's an idea that you go in and you correct the situation for redistribution or other ways, and actually that is not effective. And I'm a little bit thinking, you mentioned Amartya Sen, and of course Stefano Zamagni was also a great fan, and he refers to Amartya Sen very often, also in the context of Ken Arrow's impossibility theorem with regards to how can we actually achieve social choice and social cohesion and agreement on important matters. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Amartya Sen and Rawls had a long-going conversation on this veil of ignorance that Rawls is suggesting in his theory of justice. And again, I think Amartya Sen was saying, well, the veil of ignorance, of course, is not, to your point, truly phenomenological. It's not in the being. It's something very abstract that is unrealistic. But on the other hand, moving away from that very rationalistic conception of what the contract between people and society could be would potentially make things worse. So how would you respond to that? So if we said, if I follow your logic, one, we would not necessarily have international institutions at the moment. We have globalized business, but nationalized legal systems.
Yeah.
But we would then need to intervene in a way that forces businesses in a kind of deontic fashion to not do certain things, right?
Yeah.
Or we would need to refrain individual freedom, to go from negative freedom to positive freedoms, and try to somehow find a logic whereby we redistribute rights in a different fashion. Is there not a risk that we will mess things up?
There is a risk, and there are certain unintended consequences which can be detrimental. There's no doubt. And remember also that several of these ideas were suggested at a time during the Cold War. That's quite important, because what many of the Hayek, particularly, what they had in mind was communism. So for them, it was some kind of central planning. It is the ghost in the machine. It's some kind of central planning which somehow organizes a society. And Hayek is absolutely right. You know, central planning does have negative consequences for, if you take it, as the organizing principle for a society. However, the way I see things, it is slightly different. It is for me, it is a constant effort to endogenize externalities. That is, any kind of business activity produces externalities. The environment is the obvious externality that we're confronted with. Now, if you take the very narrow business point of view, then you don't focus on externalities. You are concerned with the internal workings of the firm and how the firm can run as efficiently as possible for its shareholders. But if you bring in externalities, if you endogenize externalities, that is, if you make organizations confront and properly cost the kind of externalities they produce, then you are widening the scope of their activity, and you are forcing them to consider more things than they would otherwise consider. And for me, this is quite important. This is where, if you like, the social dimension of business comes in. If you take it seriously.
Sorry for interrupting, Harry, but I think your point about you talk about moral agency, and I think this is exactly where I was going. Where's the agency vis-a-vis the institutional or structural lens? Because what I've seen in business is that forcing that you just mentioned of the firm is very often coming via compliance and minimum standards, which, as we know, erode the very ethical predisposition of the actor very often. No, so I was just ticking boxes.
Not necessarily. Sure. If you take, take the food industry. One of the arguments in the food industry is make food companies appreciate some of the negative consequences, the externalities of what they do. Obesity, for example. The traditional argument was the customer is sovereign. They choose whether they will consume our products or not. That was, if you sort of, and I'm speaking now roughly, that would be a fascinating topic to explore historically. I think we see the kind of more narrow emphasis on splitting the consumer choice from that of the producer. The producer does whatever allegedly the consumer wants, but then again, the desires of the consumer are shaped by the producer to some extent, as well as by society at large, by the kind of standards that we hold out for ourselves collectively through political choices we make, but also through the language that we often use. So one of the things that I see in the last few years is a kind of emergence, a coming back of the language, or the emphasis on the common good. That is as much a linguistic emphasis as the emphasis on consumer choice or individual choice, a la Hayek and a la Friedman. So if you you change the language and you give emphasis on the common good, somehow you change your perspective and you see different things that you wouldn't see otherwise. And of course, there are multiple steps. One is if we introduce the concept of the common good in our behavior, what do we do differently? And how do we do things differently as a corporation? And as a society, if we take the notion of the common good seriously, how to organize ourselves? How do we regulate some of the goods corporations provide to society in a way that will be consistent with what we understand to be a good society, a decent society? Of course, there are many levels of analysis here, but I think this broader context is important, to me at least, to be able to understand organizations better, that is, in more relational terms.
So what I hear, but I think that's almost a little bit a summary, and we might want then to go even a step further. But what I hear is that you're saying, well, there is also maybe such a thing like an enabling bureaucracy if it's done
in the right fashion. Exactly.
You're also saying, you're also talking about the aspirational effects of laws, and of course language. And I think the language one is, of course, something which is very dear to your heart, just kind of framing it differently and making sure that we talk about the common good again. And indeed, it is everywhere in the newspaper nowadays, and I haven't read that 10 years ago, is already making something with us and is providing some hope with us. I can remember that Henry Mintzberg yet still said, well, even that is probably not enough. We need a very active, plural society who then also is active as citizens and really kind of also contributing to the common good, and is making corporations still internalizing beyond what could an institutional ethics.
Yes, yeah, I am familiar with Henry's argument, and I entirely agree. I think we do see this in kind of advanced, mature democracies. We do see this institutional pluralism. We see the active NGOs shaping public discourse. We see the corporations being forced to be more accountable for the practices that they do. Just to remind ourselves of the story about the pandemic, when the issue for licensing, vaccine licensing came into the public discourse as to whether it would be necessary and desirable for Pfizer and the big companies, pharmaceutical companies, to offer the license to make the vaccine into third world countries. Now, this has been an argument. And to my delight, only a couple of days, I read that Merck does offer the license for the vaccine for the pill against COVID to be manufactured in countries outside Europe and North America, and that is a good thing. But again, this kind of shift, I think, it is organizations respond to public pressure, and this will take us to institutionalism. If we change the way we understand ourselves at a societal level as citizens, organizations are bound to respond to this, simply because otherwise they would be seen as morally illegitimate. You can't afford to be alienated or to alienate society, in the long term. So organizations do respond, I think, or at least they have incentives to respond, depending, of course, on the pressure and the politics and many other things. It's not easy, but at least we create a dynamic that makes it possible.
Well, we cite you on this because we're going to talk to Paul Adler on Friday, who is quite sure this is not enough. And he's arguing that we need to go back to socialism. So in that sense, it's interesting. I think we have the whole space here to develop. Otti, do you already want to go into the next questions? Because I see you have your mic on.
I thought... So, Paul, I would suggest Paul would argue that it's forward, because in spite of all the narrative around socialism, he would probably argue that there is very little historical evidence of actually true democratic socialist, at least, societies being implemented. And therefore, it's probably also in his mind rather something new. But yes, I think, Harry, very interesting. And I heard a number of things. So the language, which reminds me of Wittgenstein's and language games, But I also hear moral agency, and I certainly believe that without a degree of moral agency at individual and maybe collective level in organizations, it's not going to be enough just to impose kind of different external conditions. And I think the challenge, and we will get there in a second, is kind of how can we move on that way? It's probably a combination of different things that needs to occur. Because I would suggest that, again, and I loved something else came up whilst you spoke in your book. I think you're writing or citing that the ability to produce something doesn't give you the right to produce something. And I think this is really at the core of the morality. Just because we can do things, it doesn't mean that we should do things. And I think in your description of phronesis, what caught me was also this idea, I'm acting, and through the acting, I become a vision of myself, and ideally kind of a better vision of that flourishing myself that I want to constitute through my very being and acting. And I think that is a very powerful perspective, but I don't think many people would share that.
This is what praxis is all about. And I'm not very happy with simply talking about practice-oriented type of research or understanding. Praxis is more radical because praxis emphasizes the kind of moral image that necessarily or is inherent into our actions. The way we relate to others is reflected, manifested in the actions that we undertake. So praxis is always, whether we like it or not, we intend it or not, is making a statement about the kind of agent we are and about the kind of how we relate to other agents around us. It is bound. So if you take a very narrow view of the Homo Economicus, the Homo Economicus is a certain type of agency. It leaves out certain other orientations, focusing only on some kind of utility maximization, but that in itself is to sustain a certain view of moral agency. Of course, as you know, interestingly, Adam Smith was never entirely the economist that he's often portrayed to be. Smith, the moral philosopher, was of an Aristotelian disposition, and he was familiar with these ideas that, in business, like in anything else we do in life, the way we relate to others and what we aim at are necessarily morally oriented questions.
I think in this context, again, also with Friedman, I find it sometimes curious that people deprive these concepts of their historical dimension, because, of course, in a 1789 or a kind of an 18th century context, the liberation of the professions and the guilds to actually start to transact with each other was prevalent on people's mind. It's hardly comparable with the 21st society, where that ability is already there, and the liberation and emancipation that was in the very context of Smith's philosophy proposals is not relevant as such, and therefore this idea that it was always embedded in a common set of norms of a belonging in place and responsibility and reputation, and his theory of moral sentiments, I think, was very quickly forgotten. But Antoinette, do you have another question in this section, or do you want to go to organization?
No, I wanted to go to the next section, but I'm just also thinking, I mean, this is exactly what we were looking at with, for instance, some money with the relational goods. This is, of course, and I find that, I mean, I hear agency, but I have to think also a lot about how the embeddedness, the relational embeddedness, I'm sure we are going to talk about, if we are going to talk about social practices, where you, of course, are also very prominent. And I find that is an important thing, that we really understand that, again, that we are not atomistic, and that you cannot just summarize our individual behaviors and that is it. But I think this is exactly how we are going to start the next part, because the next part is about how would you operationalize goodness in organizations. And before we can make that, I think it's very important that people understand your onto-epistemological assumptions. And maybe we do that along the practice turn, because you're, of course, always also coming from that direction. Could you explain us what is an organization from that point of view? How do we learn about organizations? and also the praxeology. What mode of actions can we distinguish if we look at the world through this lens?
Yes, I mean,
context, Harry, would you mind clarifying practice versus process turn versus anything else that is?
Yeah, well, that was a discussion we had.
Yeah, yes, I don't make that distinction very strongly. It's only for analytical or research purposes. For me, the process view and the practice view sort of are built on distinct philosophers who, however, I think share a lot in common. And what they share in common, for me at least anyway, it is a certain suspicion towards reason, capital R, that is sovereign reason, that is and the omniscient reason, if you like, and that is, I think, it is shared by practice and process philosophers. So depending on what we're talking about, I may be sort of referring to one set of philosophers or to another. If I want to emphasize the how of things and the becoming of things, the change of things, then process philosophy lends itself more naturally. If I want to emphasize the kind of gestalt, the configurational way, the embeddedness of human agency, then I find it more persuasive to use the language of practice. Now, from an ontological point of view, organizations are, of course, there are entities in a legal sense, but in the way that we experience organizations is what is more important, and organizing, therefore, the way people relate to one another, and how therefore we become organized constantly in an ongoing fashion, and that is, if you like, I think the lens that process philosophy brings out. And in organizational studies, I think the work of Carl Weick stands out in this. So organizing is the way people relate to one another and the way they establish common frameworks and how they reproduce these frameworks in practice through their actions. And by reproducing them, they also modify and change them in an ongoing fashion. Now, the praxeology, the praxeology is the kind of how this knowledge relates to practice. And the traditional way in which knowledge relates to practice is the instrumental way. That is, if I explore something, I can find out some causal associations, then I can offer them back to practitioners that A is related to B, or even better, A causes B, and therefore they can take that kind of knowledge and they can put it into practice, pretty much like technical knowledge about anything. That is one view of the actionability of business knowledge, but I think there's another view as well, which is that knowledge is also related, it is also internally related to what people do. If we change the vocabulary, the way we understand ourselves, for example, then we also change the way we see one another and see ourselves in the world, and that repositions ourselves in the world. So we can effect change, not necessarily through in an instrumental way by implementing a corpus of knowledge, but also by enabling us to find out the way we do things in a reflective way, in a reflexive way, and by standing back, and we can see ourselves in the mirror, as it were, and we can adapt and change the way we do things. That is a different understanding. Wittgenstein would be here very appropriate, I think. One way would be, for example, in a practical context, to see how people use certain concepts, quality, for example, or authority. The way these concepts are used, this is what these concepts indicate. If we can sort of spot it, and this is a kind of knowledge, if you like, that if offered back to practitioners, then they can see themselves at a higher level, at the meta level, and they can see how they use certain terms, and they would not, which would not necessarily have been aware of before. So this kind of knowledge is, I call it therapeutic, in the sense that it enables us to redescribe what we do and therefore reconstitute our practice. And still, it is quite important that we do this in depth and be coherent and be systematic and all these things. But it's not necessarily offering a corpus of causal knowledge, which, if implemented, will lead to certain results.
I want to build a little bit, Harry, if I may, because that is the grounding, and I think it's for us, it's always a little bit. How can I say this? So as a practitioner, the comparison, like you already said, of some of these approaches, the process, the practice, and even the institutional perspective, I have to admit, for me as a practitioner, add very little. In the hermeneutical perspective of what I'm doing from a day-to-day perspective, because it's at the end of the day, it's about how my agency gets influenced by the structures, the context around me. And I wanted to go a little bit into two things, maybe. We looked at McIntyre's VPI model. So this idea of virtuous practice and institution. And interesting that you mentioned communism, because of course McIntyre came from a more Marxist position, and therefore I think his skepticism vis-a-vis institutions, as you and many others rightly point out, is probably in today's context not justified. But there's a lot to be taken from the idea that practices shape virtues. Virtues are what creates at least the balancing in terms of, or the predisposition for, you call it, I think, collective constitutive ends, the production of internal goods, and the institution, if it's good, enables the balancing of success and excellence, success and praxis. I must admit, Antoinette and I have argued about this a lot. Because frankly, if I take a modern firm, I associate the practices with functions, IT and marketing and sales and operations and whatever the specializations may be. And I'm a manager, I'm a qualified project manager, program manager, transformation manager. So there's a body of knowledge, there's practices, there's certain standards that come with that trade. But I can assure you that in 30 years, the development of virtues, the development of moral agency, or the development, I think you call it, of a certain kind of life that is proposed through that practice, has not been the focus of any of my developments. So I wonder whether the practice perspective is not somewhat too romantic in their beliefs that the practices will create a nurturing environment for virtues to happen, or alternatively, that maybe McIntyre wasn't so wrong, that institutions in this neo-capitalist or neoliberal capitalist context are so powerful that they're eroding the moral content of the practices. I just wonder what your thinking is.
Yeah, and maybe just one thing, because the question was very clear, but I just wanted to say, of course, we had in between something like community of practice, and you bring the example of the photo technicians of Xerox, for instance. So I'm also not so sure whether this is also something we don't reflect enough about, but that's just why we were arguing. And now I give you the floor, of course, to answer.
Yeah, I think these are, very good points. One distinction we can make is between technical competencies and moral virtues. In any kind of profession, any kind of job that people do, obviously they have some kind of technical competencies, even minimal, whatever, no matter how skilled or unskilled a job is, there are certain kind of technical competencies which are required, but also critically certain moral virtues to carry out, to enact these competencies. So I'm a software programmer, I'm a teacher, I'm a nurse. Whatever I do, and I'm qualified, I have the technical competencies, but at the same time, I work with others in the context of communities to produce something for the sake of something else. So they're always this kind of goal-oriented, and I need to be equipped with the right virtues to be conscientious, to be cooperative with my fellow workers or my other people at work, to be courageous when I confront some difficult choices and dilemmas, Therefore, there's always an underlying way of life. And I give examples in my papers based on other colleagues' work of when routines are enacted, for example, when in an Italian telecoms company, for example, when the engineers, they want to be spontaneously responsive to customer complaints, for example. That again, it underlies a certain conception. Why would this be? This is a valuable. There's always something valuable in a collectivity, which we may not necessarily know it at the top of my heads, but we certainly orient ourselves because we have been habituated into a certain community. And this is what tacit knowledge is all about, of course. It is not having to think about it explicitly. So this kind of moral orientation is always there. And in fact, what we can do as scholars is to bring it out and give it more prominence than what it has taken to have
should we then suggest, and I think, sorry, I was interrupting. Should we then suggest, as you were suggesting yourself, I think in one of your papers on phronesis, that there is a difference between that moral agency or the virtues development, I think you call it hermeneutic, practical development, but the development of the humility that is required to accept certain standards and the social skills and virtues required to collaborate qua practitioner, vis-a-vis what we've been talking about earlier, which are almost virtues qua citizen. And you mentioned yourself in one of your texts, virtues qua human being.
Yes.
And I'm almost thinking that different levels of morality, and if I'm in whatever whatever practice I might be, I might not be necessarily be pointed, as you said earlier yourself, towards thinking about ecological consequences. And that might also not be part of the differentiation that the institution does, because that's focused on the customer, even if, of course, stakeholders could be ever expanding, so to speak. But in the very practice itself, it might kind of take a long time for that thought to become prevalent. So a morality that transcends anything that is directly related to the practice.
Yes, I think you mentioned Blaine Fowers earlier, and I think when in some of his work is you see what I think they call the I think I have it in front of me, the blueprint function, something what it is to be a human being, that is, some broader understanding of what it is to be a moral agent, what it is to be a human being. So as well as these virtues, humility, kindness, courage, and so on, this kind of certain blueprint, certain of what this is all about. What are we in the business of? What are we doing and ought to be doing collectively as an organization? I see all these dilemmas in the last few weeks in Facebook. What is it all about? Is it about merely connecting people? I can quote verbatim Zuckerberg about 7-8 years at the beginning, at the early days of Facebook, when he said, the business of Facebook is all about connecting people. What the people communicate is not my business. To some extent, he keeps saying this. You can hear the echo to some extent, but not to the same extent as before. Why? Because we have higher expectations of what Facebook should be about. We hold the company to higher standards so that the content of communication is not left out now, but should be endogenized, should become constitutive of how the company defines itself and what it contributes to the common good of society. And that presupposes, again, a certain way of life. What is the good life? The way we understand ourselves today is that the good life is a life which is freed from hate speech, free from misinformation, insofar as it is possible. Whereas 10 years ago, when social media were in the early days, we wouldn't necessarily have the same view. Then at that time, this kind of technical connectivity would probably be more important. But in the course of time, as we experience social media more, we have higher expectations.
And I'm kind of hearing like there are two tales here. The one Otti was spinning is the McIntyring view that often institutions are more toxic and not helpful in kind of redefining maybe or sustaining practice. But in your article, which we found so interesting, you of course also think about how could that look different. So you are talking about the good purpose, for instance, as something what a strategy practitioner could do. You were also talking about how excellence can be sustained in practices in a way that they're not kind of too self-referential as well. Because, of course, over time, we can forget about the common good. I mean, the research is a good example. We want to publish just 8 journals, nobody reads them. That's not to the common good, probably. Sorry, I mean, we can always also play it a little bit along our organization. So maybe you explain us a little bit how how strategy as practice can be even a good force in enabling the internal practices of the organizations to be sustained, to go into the right direction, to contribute to common.
In my work, in the paper that you mentioned earlier, I highlight the importance of values articulation work. That is, a strategist articulates the purpose of the organization. Actually, it's not an original idea. It goes back decades, but it is sort of positions it more centrally into the work of a strategist to articulate the purpose of the organization and to keep reflecting on the purpose of the organization. That again, it's part of the language change, the linguistic shift, which, if to the extent it happens, it widens the way we view organizations. Then the second task is to sustain capabilities. That is, to structure the organization and give it routines which over time enable people to develop capabilities. And of course, this is, in Aristotelian term, part of habituation, because when you do something repeatedly, you also build character. You also internalize what is important in the profession and in the organization. And then there is differentiation work. That is, from a strategic point of view, the strategist needs to think about the future as well as the present, or as I put it in the paper, needs to make the future as relevant as the present. And that is quite important. So to differentiate the organization from other organizations, it is important. And to do all these three things, it is quite challenging. So what I call balance work, it is balancing the internal routine, the capabilities, which are inner focused, and the differentiation work, which is outer focused. On the one hand, you've got to hone your capabilities in the organization by developing appropriate routines. And at the same time, you've got to be externally focused to be able to keep an eye on how you differentiate yourself from other organizations, and balancing these two. And that calls for judgments on the part of those who lead organizations.
I think this point on judgment, which I think we're going to come to in a second, for me, certainly as a business leader over the last 25 years or so, is the most relevant, because I think many people probably, when they hear strategy, still think strategic planning, right? So from competitive assessment to visioning, strategy creation, implementation, also investment plans, and an implementation cascade in big programs, projects, KPIs, and so on. Whereas I think where we are going in many of our conversations with forward-thinking organizational designers and practitioners, it's much more about organizational designs that enable participative decision-making on sociocracy, holacracy, or market-based internal models like Rand and Hayi and Hire. So much more fluid organizational designs that enable local decision-making very close to the change of the outside world, the customer, the requirements, or any other shifts that happen locally. And I think here, what you describe is probably something that in a modern organization would happen dialogically. So it's not necessarily, again, when people think there's a boardroom where people go through an annual cycle of strategic planning. It's actually the sharpening of that judgment, that capability of bringing together the moral dimension the future dimension with the how do we translate that into the right capabilities that we need in this specific contingent context, in this part of the organization,
precisely.
working across practices. Because again, in an agile organization, this notion of practice, which is probably more divisional firm, has been long gone, right? We were creating circles where we have every practice around the table to collectively figure out what's the next best action. So I wanted to ask you one question in this context, because I saw you're quoting Bateson quite a bit. And of course, Bateson being a first-hour cybernetic thinker, and again, after the Cold War, after the Second World War, so with a specific lens again, but you are working on system thinking quite a bit. So I wonder, how do you bring an almost institutional, structural practice perspective together with a system perspective? What is that? What is the difference in the lens?
I was earlier today, I was looking at my teachers, the late Stafford Beer's book, The Heart of the Enterprise. Stafford Beer was, in my view, the most eminent organizational cybernetician. So, and he defines the system as a set of parts which are connected to form a pattern for a certain purpose. And the purpose, again, bringing in the language of second-order cybernetics, is attributed by an observer. So systems do not necessarily have an inherent purpose, but the purpose is attributed by the observer. So that to me introduces again the purpose of the organization. The system indicates interactivity. Indicates some kind of striving for coherence, hence back to my process-oriented language, the way people interact to form common understandings. So if you take the process view, then you're trying to see how the system is being formed and being renewed at any point in time. The system, again, may take a different purpose, depending on who defines and how the system is defined. And I see different emphasis, again, like process and practice, but I don't see opposition. For me, Bateson is a superb, one of my intellectual heroes, because he brings out all this in his phrase, the pattern that connects, the kind of the unity that we see in the natural and the human world through the language that he provides. And again, he was a very much process-oriented thinker, and you can see also some kind of, the moral philosophy that in aspects of his work, depending on what parts of Bateson one looks at. But for me, there is some kind of convergence. I see different emphasis and a vocabulary differently used for different purposes.
So we landed in systems theory, which is not my favorite, but it's more Otti's one. But I would love to, and I think probably Lumon would be a little bit closer because of his language affinity, but I think we're not going there now because otherwise we really are up there somewhere. I want to bring us back to practical wisdom. And also to what you said about reflection in practice or reflection in action, because that's another one where we kind of debated. You explained, in my opinion, very well how this reflection in praxis is happening, how we're absorbed, the surprises which makes us deliberating. But where we were really discussing quite a lot is whether this is enough. Do you develop your practical wisdom, but also your practice just by this, or do you need additional development, which is, for instance, done by developmental psychology? So this is something, I mean, Otti, you can probably say something in addition here, but this is something where we also debated quite a lot.
Let me just adding one thing. So you mentioned earlier that Bill Torbert is familiar with you. And Bill Torbert happens to be one of my heroes, particularly the book that he wrote about the power of balance. And it's very intriguing how he develops, going back to not only people like Keegan and Erickson and Piaget and even Gurdjieff and so on, how he's developing his own theory and framework of developmental stages. But whereas other people focus on rather abstract stages, he's in favor of the action turn, also from an epistemological perspective. And he's very careful in framing these stages, so to speak, not as exclusive stages, but as logics of action. And that being in the action is the most important aspect that for him becomes relevant. And you described the same. The temporality becomes important. The relationships, it's not reflecting on action, it's reflecting in action. But built over it, I think he developed 6 or 7 different levels. And quite strikingly, and I just wanted to put this in front of you, is I think the 4th level in his framework is the expert. And he almost characterizes the expert as the perfect practitioner, who is really close and involved and embedded in that practice. And the next step in his framework becomes the achiever, who's someone working across practices and actually taking in the institutional logic. So again, very interesting similarities in language. But then the most important step is the step beyond that, beyond the institution, where people start to distance their own identity from the institutional logic and question some of the moral norms and the ways that the institution as such, whatever organization we might be talking about, is acting within. And that requires, in a Keegan term, so to speak, the holding their own identity object and looking at what are the possible epistemologies, what are the ways to define my identities, what is good. And I'm almost wondering whether that is not an aspect that is kind of hermeneutically, so to speak, missing in your framework, in as much as if I'm not stepping out of my own identity as a practitioner inside the practice or inside the institution, I might still be falling prey of some wrong logics, in inverted commas, of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of Dreyfus' work on the stages of expertise as well. Mm-hmm. I like, I mean, models which are based on stages are extremely useful in orienting us and understanding the trajectory of development. But they also have the drawback that there is the question: what stage am I now? Am I falling back? Am I moving on? That's an open-ended question. What is important to me, it is to be able to realize that what Scott Fitzgerald famously said, that, you know, the feature of a complex mind is to be able to hold simultaneously together 2 contradictory propositions. And I think that's always at the back of my mind as well. That is, and Carl Weick has famously remarked that ambivalence is the optimal response. So it is the practitioner develops, going through several stages, what we would call more conventional experience, and organizing patterns of experience in ever better ways, in more refined ways, and then being able to move on and take a step back from action. This is what I understand to be the last stage, where you become aware of your own identity, of other epistemological roots, other identities, and then you try to bring in a dialogue between these opposing or different identities of views. That's an ongoing process, of course. It never stops, provided one wants to complexify oneself and which means to be able to see more subtle, to make ever more subtle distinctions in the world. And to come back to practical wisdom and judgment, of course, judgment requires experience, and organizing that experience in such a way as to bring out the subtle differences that one encounters in different situations. Of course, there's been a lot of research on this. You know, Heber Simon and many cognitive psychologists have written about how experts organize their cognitive worlds to enable them to do this. But there's also, from a phenomenological point of view, to take it further, to highlight the importance of experience and the importance of training the body, which is extremely important, and also the importance of emotions in orienting people and as to what is the most salient features of a situation they encounter. It's never a purely cognitive thing.
I wonder, again, speaking as a manager, so to speak, or leader, whether there might, in contrary to McIntyre's rather negative view of the management practice, which he doesn't see as a practice, where there is not potentially the management function as the guardian of the institution, whether there's not also a role in management in providing glue between practices on the one hand, as you already point out, between practices and the external world, the customers, other stakeholders, but also maybe between the individual and the practice themselves. So there's that vertical development, that ability to look at their own identity within the practice and beyond is something that doesn't necessarily come natural, even if people become the best professions, as you pointed out, from a skills perspective. And I think there might be in itself heuristics, concepts, tools, methods that require an enactment that is not normally embedded in the practice as such, which is more focused on the production, and even as their virtues production, so to speak, it wouldn't necessarily go into, let's say, coaching techniques and the like.
Yes,
I wonder there might be a new role of management.
With your Tsoukas article, I think this is exactly the idea. And I mean, that would be meaning that managers would be able to do that as well. I mean, as a researcher trying to kind of bracket or understand the reflection in action, and then you are offering, of course, already a dialogical inquiry, and I think that could be how to go.
Yes, and if you remember in the diagram in the paper that you mentioned, I try to consider what I call self-enclosure, the self-referential possibilities that always exist in practices. So that is, it is a useful reminder that even the most sophisticated practice can become trapped in itself, can develop in a way, can become a bubble, if you like. So there's always that good management in that sense is the constant pricking of bubbles, so that the reminding of people that we're in danger of being in a bubble, hence the need to engage in dialogically with others. And I'm glad you brought dialogicality, because this is quite an important thing. It is, I don't think we have many other ways to break our bubbles than except through dialogical engagement. You say something?
Which again might point to practices, so to speak, required. So if we think about appreciative inquiry, the art of hosting, or any kind of dialogic practices that can be embedded in the institution, so to speak, that might be the role of management. Maybe I'm just trying to argue for management as a practice, but I
think you're right. I mean, this is a debate, an issue of debate. I happen to be one of these people who does believe that management is some sort of practice. I think McIntyre takes, in my view, a relatively simplistic view of management. And if you accept the idea that organizations have an institutional dimension, then you've got to accept also that they ought to be managed. Now, how they are to be managed, what management is all about, these are debatable issues. They vary across time and space, of course. Management is not an eternal concept, but the very idea that institutions need to be managed and the link between practices and institutions also needs to be sustained and refined, then management is quite an important function in organization. It has always been.
But I then wonder, because I mean, I read that in your article and it also resonated very strongly. But then I wonder what would have to change in the way that we frame management. How would we socialize managers maybe differently? How would we make clear that they themselves are a profession? I mean, what is your suggestion here? Because you have looked at some of these things again as well.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is, and again, McIntyre would be right here on this, that is modern management and modern organizations, modernity at large, splits the moral dimension from everything else. So to take a kind of a more sophisticated view of management will be to reintroduce the moral dimension into what management practice is about. The classic example brought up by Arendt in The Banality of Evil and used also by McIntyre, the example of Eichmann, who sort of the archetypal administrative man who sort of ticked boxes and then efficiently connected the parts of the system leading to the extermination of people, and then never wondering what is it all about, what does it aim at, and to be able to reflect on a systematic basis on the purpose of collective activities, to remind people that they should not be driven by pure process, by pure mechanics, by pure routine, but they should always, at the back of their minds, have what is it all about. The purpose of a collective activity is quite important, and it's one of the functions of management.
So maybe I'm just thinking a little bit wildly now. We could use positive psychology because they talk about job crafting. So maybe we need to do a different type of job crafting. We could also think about organizational roles in a different way. Otti, we were talking to Carol, but I can never summarize her role ideas.
Nodal roles, yes.
I think that's quite it's very important. I like the idea of job crafting. We craft our jobs all the time without realizing it. Again, from a process point of view, it is a reminder that with every choice we make, we reconstitute our role to some extent, except most of the time we're not aware of it. So becoming aware of this reconstitutive role, the reconstitutive process through which our roles are formed in time, it is quite important. And therefore, we have a responsibility in how we do so. So it's not that I don't have choices, there are always choices available. And it's the question of whether I have the subtlety and the moral sensitivity and whatever else in the complex hermeneutical mind to be able to relate to what the situation I'm in order to deliver a response which is appropriate to the situation. And of course,
remember Alejo, and I'm still not Italian. Alejo, apologies if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, as we learned he's not Spanish, but Filipino. And he mentioned that roles carry a special morality. And that is certainly something that I resonate very strongly with, and also in Bill Tobit's work. That is one of the aspects, I think, in his writing, that sometimes we step into the role without necessarily examining that. Almost in complexity terms, you would almost say it's an attractor. I think you're right, it creates expectations of patterns of behavior. Susan Long, the organizational role analyst, researcher and professor in Australia, described examples of firemen who, whilst not being courageous as individuals, stepping into the role of firemen, would virtuously, so to speak, throw themselves into the fire to save lives. Whereas as individuals, as people, they were not courageous at all. But the power of the role can also be very positive in that regard. But it is powerful.
Exactly.
And I think what John Lurie, one of our friends, is always suggesting is that people might not need to often go through that personal development work, really querying their own paradigms and so on, actually by just renegotiating roles in a more open fashion, creating the space between IT and sales, or marketing and product, or so operations and sales. We might create big shifts in behaviors in organizations. And I think, like you say, and Antoinette, I think you're right, redesigning roles, but also creating spaces where people can interrogate their personal stepping into roles, what it means, and the different expectations that come with roles is very, very powerful.
And to add to this, to see yourself part of something broader. That's where the system comes in, it seems to me. To be seen as yourself as the role that you play as being part of a pattern of roles, and you've got to maintain that coherent pattern in the organization, and you contribute to it. It is not something, whether you are aware of it or not, you are contributing to the very constitutive role pattern within which your particular role is embedded.
Very interesting conversation, I think, bringing the patterns, the roles, and the system together. I think we wanted to briefly touch on, and maybe if we close in the next 8-9 minutes, so reform. If we go a little bit beyond phronesis into transforming society, you've written about the reform of political institutions, and Antoinette, that was a paper that you looked into. I'm sure you've got a question on that, and then I think I would love to go back to academia, and very much in the spirit of what Henry Mintzberg was talking about, that management is not be learned in the classroom, and strategy is not tomatoes in a hothouse, but weeds in the garden. So I just wonder what the implications are for academia to make it better suited to help us to get back to the common good. But I think, Antoinette, do you want to go?
No, I don't want to go there. I think we just do the academia, because we always don't have the time in the end to pick your brain for something else, which we also wish to do. And I think the academia one is an important one. I would say, sorry, Harry, to say that, maybe you were better, but I believe in the last 20 years, business schools have failed to develop practical wisdom and moral character. So what should we do differently?
I think we should redesign the curriculum, not just with the technical means in mind, the instruments, but also to show people how to use these instruments in a responsible manner. Again, one needs to carry out a systematic study of business schools curricula, but my feeling is, having been around for 3 decades now, it is that business schools have seen so primarily themselves as, in scientific terms, that is, come to us and we will give you the tools to manage technically organizations in the best way possible, which means efficiently and serving the shareholders and so on. And they have neglected, I think, the more practical dimension of organized life, and that requires a different epistemology. But having said this, I think in the last 10, 20 years, we do see things in that direction. We see the arts going into the business curricula. We see an emphasis on judgment and CSR and responsibility. But I think the difference will be to somehow blend them nicely together. And I think those business schools that will do so in a more integrated way, they will blend these together, the technical and the moral and the artistic and the scientific. I think they will gain a competitive edge, if you like.
I'm going to write president. That's already something I can use. Sorry, I was interrupting you.
No, that's all right. But it's not easy to do so. You know, it goes against the traditional academic mentality of disciplinary thinking.
And against our incentives. So we
against
do have
exactly
a lot
against
of toxic practices now.
Against our incentives and so on. But I feel the need, and the need is widely recognized now, that we should do things to integrate our knowledge, and that's encouraging and promising.
The other day we made some performativity with our students, because we showed them Stockhausen's Helicopter Quartet. So if you ever want to look that up, that was very performative. And then they realized that they had a very fixed view on art, and it helped them to understand that thinking things from a different perspective would be very important. So I think that's very, very helpful. Otti, you wanted to ask something? Otherwise, I will go into the lightning quiz.
On that, as here in Lisbon with the House of Beautiful Business, as it's called, I had an interesting conversation with Jan Henriksen, who's working with the Stockholm Business School. And indeed, I thought a good example, they have a practice of bubble bursting, where all the students have to go through a practice of examining their own bubbles and actually go out on the streets and talk to other people, refugees or prostitutes or people without in shelters and so on, and actually write essays about that reflection. And I think some of that, as you say, bringing morality back in. And I think that, please, all of you academics, don't forget us practitioners, because I did my MBA in 2007, and frankly, I haven't heard from all of you since then in terms of helping managers who are kind of having impacts on people's lives today to actually become better in what they do. And I think it's very difficult whilst you're in the action to actually get insight in the right fashion or in an appropriate fashion to become better.
Yeah.
And I think with that, I can only say, Harry, what a wonderful conversation. And apologies, we've really torn you from topic to topic all over the place.
I enjoyed it. That's my natural inclination as well, to go from flower to flower, like a bee going from flower to flower.
With the flowering, I think we want to close you out, if you allow us. We always try to have closure in these sessions, and of course a little playfully. Antoinette has a little quiz of, I think, 5 or 6 questions in 1 minute. So the idea is to just come with the first thing on your mind in an answer or any qualification. And with that, we will then surrender the session. Antoinette, do you want to head into the quiz?
Yes. I think I start with something which is easy for you to answer. If we give you 8 hours to discuss whatever is at your heart, with whom would you like to spend these 8 hours? I give you 4 options: Heidegger, Schatzky, Wittgenstein, or Dewey.
Heidegger.
Okay.
I have many things to ask him, that's why.
But actually, I suggested the question, what would you ask him? Because I'm still not so clear on where he is. Dasein and existence, it's very, very exciting.
I would ask him about his politics as well. I would ask him how he reconciled his philosophical view with some of his political views at some point in time. So yes, and of course what Hannah Arendt asked him after the war: why did you keep silent? Why did you not say something about the Nazis and so on? Anyway, I would love to to have had this opportunity, as many others, I'm sure.
Unfortunately, we don't have the time machine yet, but if we invent it, we're the first who is going to travel with it, I'm going to promise. Now, that almost leads a little bit to the next question, because you wanted to talk about this with him as well. Good societies need, and I give you also options, more markets, more engaged citizenship, more collective ownership, or more moral practices?
I think they need engaged citizenship. I think for me, it's the most important thing. To maintain the spirit of the polis, the spirit of the city, and the engagement in a common project. Okay.
Now we want to make you a little bit more stepping into the corporate world, and we give you an option to be a CEO of one of the following 3 companies. Which one would you choose? Mondragon, Nestle, or the Johns Hopkins Hospital?
I love hospitals, so Johns Hopkins Hospital would probably be. I think there are brilliant settings for all of these ideas we have discussed today. But having said this, Nestle would be the most challenging.
Because otherwise I would have said you stay in your comfort zone and stick with the professional service organization, which I can understand. But I mean, let's say you are at Nestle and you can now have one option, one first intervention to make Nestle very good. What would you do?
It's thinking about obesity as a problem for society, and setting up our organization in such a way as to address it in the most responsible manner, without and maintaining our profitability at the same time.
Okay. So maybe we can, I know the wife of the CEO of Nestle, so maybe we can deal something. We'll find out. And the last one is a little bit cheeky. If we compare Nicosia and Warwick, which would you choose for? And now you can tell me each time which one of the 2s. For food?
Definitely Cyprus, in Greece.
Intellectual heritage?
The UK, Northern Europe.
Okay. And the existing political system?
Northern Europe.
Okay. Okay. Well,
yes, I'm an ardent, a crypto Northern European living in the South. But having said this, I love Lisbon. Is my other southern favorite city. I love it.
Wonderful. Then I think I will enjoy it even more. And I think, Harry, again, I want to thank you wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Otti.
We were not disappointed at all in our expectations of having this conversation.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you both. It's an honor to have had the chance to talk with you. I enjoyed it. I hope something good will have come out of it.
Definitely. So
wonderful. Thank you very much. And we might follow up by email. We will also give you the recording as soon as it's there to review and tell us whether you're okay with it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye. Take care.